So the way I'd like to introduce this session is I've written a lot of music and book and movie reviews, and I say as a grizzled but not jaded veteran, there are projects you have to review and there are projects you want to review. And typically the ones you want to review are more fun and turn out better. This weekend, all the panels, whether I'm involved in them or not, have been amazing, but this panel in particular, I've been really looking forward to because I've read both these books, I loved both these books, and I'm very, very confident that everyone's going to enjoy hearing these readings, and we've got some interesting questions. So let's introduce our writers, and they're going to read from their work, and then I've got some questions. I want to make sure we leave time for the audience to ask questions as well. To my immediate left is Robert Anthony Siegel. He is the author of 2 novels and a memoir, Criminals, My Family's Life on Both Sides of the Law. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Smithsonian, the Paris Review, the Oxford American, and other venues. He teaches workshops at Catapult in New York City, and his website is www.robertanthonysiegel.com. And Jeanne McCulloch, to his left, is a former managing editor of the Paris Review, a former senior editor of Tin House, and the founding editorial director of Tin House Books. Her memoir, All Happy Families, was published by Harper Wave, HarperCollins in 2018, and she comes to us from the hip haven of Brooklyn, New York. Please join me in welcoming Robert and Jane. And we didn't agree who was going to read first, so I'm just going to pass the mic.
Would you like me to go first?
I'm insisting on it.
Hit it. Gina, did you? Hi everyone, my name is Robert Siegel. My book is called Criminals. It's a memoir. And I'm just delighted to be here with all of you, and tremendous thanks to Sean for organizing. I got here yesterday and organizing what's just a tremendous inaugural festival. It's extraordinary how he put it together, and for a first time, it is just, it's big, it's very exciting, it's running beautifully, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to read a piece, just the beginning of a chapter in the memoir. It's called Gourmets, and the reason is we're in the run-up to lunch, and food is an important theme in the book, and it's about a heat wave. The heat wave of 1976 in Paris, actually, which was, I think, at that point, the hottest summer ever in France. But it starts in New York. Get organized here. I'm not used to doing things with both hands. And let me know if you can't hear. Gourmets. We were the kind of family that ate out a lot because home was too rancorous and depressing, and we tended to be a little nicer to each other in public. We went to the Home Fat Company on Mott Street, where the roast pork was a succulent red I've seen only in a Rothko canvas, and to the Automat, with its banks of little windows that made you feel as if the building itself knew what you wanted to eat. We went to cheesy places like Uchau's and posh places like Peter Luger. We wanted to find the perfect example of crabs in black bean sauce, of kugel with raisins. We wanted to be filled and transported, understood, and made content. Typically, we just ate too much and left dazed. And yet we never stopped believing in the transformative power of food, even as we understood deep down that it was an illusion. I'll have one of those, my father would say to the waiter, pointing to an insanely large dessert, and a dose of insulin. It was his standard joke, and it always got wary laughter because he was scarily heavy. We spent a lot of time discussing my father's weight, usually over dinner. The conceit was that he was the only one with an eating problem, because he was the only one who was obese. The rest of us were just a little husky. Your father eats to soothe his anxieties, my mother explained one night in Sammy's Romanian, drizzling clear chicken fat from a dispenser onto a big hunk of rye. He nodded, chewing. I eat because I'm depressed. That's the problem, said my mother. Food should be a form of sensual enjoyment, not a tranquilizer. My mother liked to contrast herself with my father whenever possible. He was crazy, and she was sane. He was a Slav, and she was cultured. He watched TV, and she went to the theater, the symphony, and the ballet. In the arena of food, this pattern played out through a very simple opposition. He liked steak, and she preferred haute cuisine, usually French and expensive. She kept trying to get him to take us to Lutèce, or another of the great New York restaurants, but he resisted, and not solely because of the money. Dinner was a fraught endeavor for him, so loaded with desire that he couldn't compromise very much. He needed to eat, not dine. And then she hit on a different strategy. When I turned 10, she asked me if I'd like to celebrate my birthday at a fancy French restaurant. I know a good place, she said. It's very elegant and expensive. We'll get all dressed up and it will be a big splurge. My mother looked at me with such excitement that I conceived the ambition then and there of becoming an especially elegant 10-year-old, of the sort to inspire love in distracted parents. I would become a gourmet. But doing so turned out to be far more complicated than I expected. At home, getting ready to leave for the restaurant, my father threw a blue blazer over a plaid shirt and old chinos, and then stood in the middle of the living room, showing off his bare ankles and beat-up boat shoes. What do you think, he asked my mother, looking pleased with himself. My mother, in a silk dress and heavy jewelry, checked her watch. What exactly are you trying to prove? Nothing, except that I make enough money so that I don't have to care what other people think. Don't worry, it gets worse. Their petty judgments and cheap snobberies mean nothing to me. Nothing. I'm more interested in why you want to ruin the child's birthday, she said. That's not the point. The point is comfort. Even after my father put on socks, the evening felt like a fragile enterprise, teetering on the edge of sorrow and humiliation. The restaurant was an old chestnut called the Forum of the 12 Caesars, and it was lined with marble columns on which sat the busts of noble Romans, watching the patrons feed. It looked incredibly grand to me, and the very fact of our presence there, at a little table toward the back, seemed to imply some hope that we weren't merely gluttonous and self-absorbed, and that I wasn't in danger of weeping. We were a family of elegant gastronomes who ate among the Caesars. We would prosper and be loved. Wasn't that fun, my mother said later that night, back at home. We should make a tradition of it, don't you think? Yes, I said, confused. Fun didn't seem to be the point exactly. The point was something beyond my understanding. The best I could make out very dimly was that our family was in some kind of deep and settled trouble, and our only hope was to eat complicated, delicate foods amid the hushed clink of heavy silverware. That my father didn't understand this, that he resisted it, made it all the more urgent. Every year after that, on my birthday, we went to another dizzyingly expensive restaurant picked by my mother. My father tried to wear, or not wear, something that would disrupt the occasion. And I attempted to make elegant dinner conversation while vibrating with nearly religious levels of hope, self-consciousness, and disappointment. We ate duck with figs at the Four Seasons, caviar and blinis at the Russian Tea Room. And then the year I was to turn 14, my mother said, I was thinking it might be fun to do this one in France. France? She explained that her friend Eleanor was going with a friend from work in the summer. We could join up with them for a 3-week trip across the country, going from restaurant to restaurant, sightseeing during the day and eating at night. What about everyone else, I asked, meaning the rest of the family. Your father hates to travel. And David and Perrin are too little for this kind of trip. Even better, I thought. Elegant restaurants in France without my brother and sister who were always crowding my act and stealing applause, without my father who made our attempts at fine dining look ridiculous and doomed. My mother and I would go and join the tribe of sophisticated, happy gourmets without them. In 1976, Paris had no air conditioning and was thus unequipped for the worst heat wave in 100 years. We spent our nights staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, and our days drifting through the Louvre in a dreamlike confusion. Out on the street, the city was like a gorgeous cake, baking in some kind of weird blue oven, hotter and hotter, about to burn. We sat listlessly in cafes, drinking Cokes, too tired to get up. But as the dinner hour approached, a change would come over us. Back at the hotel, my mother would open her huge suitcase and get herself into one of her many heavily beaded outfits. I would put on the only pair of dressy pants I'd remembered to pack, which happened to be thick wool. And we would go down to the lobby to meet Eleanor and her friend Mary, two large pale figures in polyester slacks, burdened with enormous tote bags and gigantic purses. The four of us would then head off to the next Michelin-starred restaurant on our list. For once, our food obsession really managed to transport us beyond rancor. Seated at a table in a velvet-walled dining room in which not a breeze stirred, we would eat 4 or 5 courses with insane gusto, the discontented and panicked parts of us appeased and quieted. Stumbling out into the steamy Parisian evening, we were at peace. Our last night before leaving the city for the countryside, it was so hot that I stripped to my underwear, wrapped myself in wet towels, and lay in my bed in the dark, trying to cool down enough to sleep. My mother spoke from her bed across the room. "Those snails," she said. "That seafood thing," I said. That evening, we had eaten in a Nouvelle seafood place that seemed to be inspired by Japanese cuisine. Things were raw or lightly cooked, absolutely fresh, served with varieties of seaweeds. My dish was a sort of bouillabaisse without broth, a collection of shellfish and other sea creatures piled in a big bowl like a floral arrangement. "I think you're starting to understand the true beauty of food," she said. "I think I am," I answered, rearranging my towels. "Your father will never understand." That was because he basically treated food like an alcoholic treats whiskey, as a form of solace and forgetting. A fight with my mother would send him wandering across the city all night, eating inhuman amounts of falafel and shawarma, cheesecake and cannoli. We would find him passed out on the couch in the morning, surrounded by empty takeout containers. While my mother thought that fine dining would save us from the suspicion that we were worthless, my father believed that eating would protect us from sorrow, that we just needed to do more and more of it, a physical deluge, an orgy of gnawing and chomping. "He eats because he's sad," I said to her. "Yes, but it's so much better to eat because you're happy," she said. I'd come to France because I wanted my mother's attention, free of competition, from my siblings and my father, but sharing a room with her felt a little odd, a little too much. She was in a nightgown, I was in my underwear and some wet towels, and I remember having to ignore the weirdness of the situation, the suspicion that I was actually too old for such unbounded intimacy, even if I still wanted it. For her part, she seemed delighted to have a roommate, someone to talk to. She was always incurably lonely, the kind of person who would talk till dawn, night after night, if you were willing to listen. She wanted to explain herself. "I went to Paris for the first time right after finishing law school," she said to me, "and the first thing I did was to sit down in a cafe and eat a little bowl of wild strawberries in cream. They tasted like perfume, and I knew then that I would never live in Brooklyn again. Your father doesn't understand that. But we don't live in Brooklyn." This was a very different Brooklyn back then, by the way, not the Brooklyn you talk about now. But we don't live in Brooklyn. That's because of me. If it were up to him, we'd still be living next to his relatives on Brown Street. The truth was that I liked my father's relatives, liked that rolled cabbage and cholent they served, the way they all sat on their porches and talked across the low brick walls to each other. My own family seemed isolated and sad in comparison. They always look so happy, I said. Because they're so limited, my mother replied. Limited was the worst thing my mother could say about somebody, implying ignorance, blindness, stupidity, lack of sophistication, and a resistance to the enlarging powers of culture. They don't know there's a world beyond Sheepshead Bay. Sheepshead Bay is part of the world too, I said. Yes, but it's a very boring part. My mother talked often about the frustration of living among people who collected porcelain figurines of shepherds and shepherdesses and sheathed their furniture in clear plastic to keep it clean, who had never been to the Museum of Modern Art, even though it was just a subway ride away, and didn't see why she had to go either. My response was usually a studied blandness, the only method I knew to avoid the fact that she was talking about her relatives, and by extension, my father. Well, nothing beats Paris, I said blandly. Yes, the city of art and cathedrals, she said, and strawberries in creme fraiche. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Jeanne McCulloch. My mother used to love those strawberries too.
Oh, but they are perfume.
They are. They're fraises de bois, but they're not in this book. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sean, for having us here. And I look forward to meeting you all after the panel. So I hope I'll get a chance to. I'm going to read from the beginning of this memoir. And I guess I won't say anything more about it until we talk. August 1983. A woman walks into the sea. It's a mid-August day, early morning. The sky is clear. A mid-August day on the beach near the end of Long Island, and it's the summer of 1983. Seagulls idle on the wet sand, and far out the fishing boats for Montauk Patrol, small as dark toys against the horizon. It's a perfect late summer day. The woman on the shore is my mother. She wears the iconic headdress of her era, a floral bathing cap with brightly colored petals. She walks cautiously, hands out for balance, because even in a calm surf, you can't be too careful walking into the sea. She always taught us that, respect for the sea. The latex petals of the cap flutter about her head, almost festive as she moves. It's early morning, and my mother walks into the sea. Behind her is our house, a long, gray, sea-weathered clapboard house, stretching along a sand dune like a giant sleeping cat. My father bought this house years before the area became known as the Hamptons, back when it was still considered a long way from New York City, known mainly for artists and potato fields, and fishermen who made their living trawling off Montauk Point. The house had a shabby grandeur to it that time forgot. No air conditioning. The sea is our air conditioner, my mother would proclaim, and no pool. The sea is our pool. Every August when I was young, it was a giant slumber party in the house by the sea. My sisters and I would fall asleep against a tumble of cousins in quilts, listening to the steady refrain of waves gliding along the shore, the moonlight outside our bedroom spackling a silver route to the horizon. August 13th, 1983 was the day of my wedding. I was 25, a messy splatter of freckles across my nose, the final badge of childhood. Just before sunset that afternoon, I would put on a vintage lace dress that swooped gently off the shoulder in a style I saw as reminiscent of Sophia Loren in her glory days, and my mother saw as suggestive of the sale rack at a yard sale. In the house that morning, they were talking in various rooms. In the pantry, the boy delivering flowers, sprays of lilies of the valley and a basket of rose petals for the wedding cake, was being bossed around by Johanna, the Irish cook. Johanna never got to boss anybody. The housekeeper, the gardener, everyone disregarded her. She was a small woman in a hairnet whose wisps of dry black hair nevertheless escaped and were often found floating in the vichyssoise. She stamped her foot, a white orthopedic shoe. "Get out of my kitchen," she was telling the delivery boy from the florist shop. "I'm too busy," she scolded him. "Go." In the sunroom, my half-brothers, 3 men in their early 40s, sons from my father's first marriage, huddled in conversation. They all had beards and ready laughs. They, in addition to my half-sister, had come for the wedding with their spouses and their children from the far-flung places where they had lives of their own. Half-siblings, and the term was apt. I half knew them, and I half didn't. Scott raised llamas in New Mexico. In Florida, Keith painted lush floral landscapes, some with naked women. Rod was engaged in investment strategies for a business in Colorado that nobody in the family understood. In my father's sunroom, the morning light angled across the sisal rug. Dust motes played in the air. And my 3 half-brothers were talking together, shoulders hunched, coffee mugs in hand. The gardener Vincent, in yellow protective earmuffs and a fishing cap, drove his seated mower in even rows up and down the sloping lawn, as he did every morning of summer, this day steering around a large white party tent that had been erected earlier in the week for the reception. My wedding was scheduled to take place at 5 in the afternoon. It had been timed and debated for months, the proper moment for a wedding. The ceremony was to be situated by the garden up by the house, with a view giving out to the sea. Situated. That was the term used by Ruth Ann Middleton, the professional wedding planner my mother had hired to marshal the wedding to perfection. A white wire gazebo had been placed there, and the florist would wreathe the lattice in garlands of pink roses. 5 in the afternoon was the time the light would be that rich gold particular to late summer. A bagpiper had been hired by my mother, so at the ceremony's conclusion, he'd guide the guests from the garden down to the tent, braying the union of husband and wife as the setting sun burnished rose through the trees. You know, men in kilts don't wear any underwear, my half-brother Keith had told us the day before the wedding, just as we were driving to visit my father. Seriously, you guys, not a stitch. Just a pink ribbon tied around the big fella. My siblings and I were in the family station wagon when he told us that, on our way to Southampton Hospital. Our father lay in a coma in the ICU, having had a massive stroke 2 days before the wedding, leaving our home for what we suspected might be the last time, strapped to an ambulance stretcher, the strap a thin, final harness to our life. He had had the stroke following an abrupt withdrawal from alcohol after a lifetime of drinking, having gone cold turkey at my mother's insistence, so he'd, in her words, sober up for the wedding. On the way to the hospital, my brother Scott had insisted we stop at the fried chicken place off Route 27 in case we got hungry. And as we stood watching our father breathe, the bucket of chicken sat unopened at the nurse's station of the ICU, filling the air with its irrelevant fragrance. We had bowed to my mother's insistence that the wedding should go forward, despite our father's condition. Because, she claimed, It's what Daddy would want. Besides, she added, all my friends are already en route. And so a man with no underwear, in a plaid skirt, was going to bray on our front lawn at sunset as my father lay in a coma over in the next town. The morning of my wedding, an easy breeze blew down the beach. My teenage nephews sat on their surfboards just beyond the break. All was calm and serene from the lilting vantage point of the sea. Occasionally a swell would captivate them, and they angled their boards towards the shore, riding in on elegant curls of foam. Later that afternoon, my mother would pin the family veil on my head. She'd mutter about how I should have let her get a proper hairdresser to tame my wild beach hair. Then she'd call the hospital and instruct them that no matter what happened that evening to her husband, they were not to call our house. Because, she'd go on to say, we were having a party. The morning of August 13th, 1983, the day settled into a steady rhythm near the tip of Long Island. Taking her swim before breakfast, which she believed was de rigueur in summertime, my mother walked into the sea.
So, needless to say, with readings like that, I don't need to make the recommendation, but I'll make it anyway. You should get copies of these books. So thank you both for reading. Throughout this conference so far, we've talked about in a lot of different ways the notion of narrative and the idea, whether it's journalism or fiction, now in memoir, you have to be truthful in the service of the story, whether it's the artifice of the story or the actual facts, or the notion of distancing yourself. If you've written fiction and people assume it's you, which is in some cases inevitable if you use the first person, but for one who attempts memoir, the writer's not even inoculated by the claim, but it didn't really happen, which any novelist can ultimately claim. And I think it's further complicated in these two memoirs because you're both writing about deeply personal family issues and things that were not very pleasant. So I would love to, and Robert, I was happy to read the interview that in the Harvard Review where you interviewed your mother. And I think that's a good way to kick this off. You wrote, and I think you just nail it here, the literary conversation around memoir pretty much always focuses on the writer's right to speak. There's little or no discussion of what it feels like to be written about. I think in both memoirs, elements of shame, self-censorship, the question of who owns the narrative, who has the right to speak, are all germane to the story you're trying to tell. And you're at once trying to make sense of some painful times, make sense of yourself, but also be true to the story. So maybe you both can speak a little bit about what that was like and the feelings of vulnerability and how that might have been received or was received, and reservations you had, or in the service of the story you knew you had to do it, etc.
Sean, that's a terrific question. Jeanne, do you want to address it first?
Sure.
I'll take it. It is a good question, and I teach memoir, and I am asked this a lot by my students, and it's a good question because anybody that sits down to write about themselves that really wants to tell a story that other people would be interested in reading. You're going, just by the sake of readability, to use some of the techniques of fiction, by which I just mean that you're going to make sure your characters are fully developed characters. You're going to make sure that the dialogue that you choose to use is going to be something that's really moving the story along, such that the reader would have a sense that they're reading like a juicy novel, even though it's fact. Then you get to the next point. What is fact in memoir? Now, just the little section I just read you guys of the beginning of my book, I could tell you it's fair to say that every other person in my family would have told that differently, particularly my mother, God knows. But what I said to my siblings when I was writing this is I said, I'm going to write about this weekend. We each have our own version of the story. I'm simply telling my version, which is as the bride, what that felt like. And once I sort of framed it that way, they felt better, and I felt a whole lot better. I mean, I think if they had chosen, they would have said, it really sucks to have a writer in the family, especially a memoirist. But at the same time, I did show them the manuscript before I sent it to my agent or my editor, as I did my first husband who's in it, because I thought that was important. But I think the one way that one as a writer can give themselves permission to write about yourself and not pretend, not hang behind something else, is to remember that memoir is different than autobiography or journalism, certainly different than a police blotter in which every witness in the room is being interviewed and every fact is being recorded. Memoir is emotional truth. And often it's advisable to wait many, many, many years to tell a story until it's fully processed. Because if you can't look at the other side of it, you really don't know what your story is yet. You know what your reaction to events is, but you can't really tell a story yet. And so I think that these are the things that I kept in mind when I decided to write this book. Also, I had always told my students, maybe your story is the story you've always been avoiding. It's the story you've always been walking around. And this was the story for me. And in fact, many people that I knew well didn't even know about the circumstances of this wedding. So it took a lot of digging, but you have to have the courage to dig.
I think that's very smart. I also tell students that memoir is a true novel. I also tell them that the search for factuality, whether or not it's foolish or doomed, is extremely fruitful to you as a writer. I know for myself that whenever I push myself towards greater exactitude, the quality of the writing takes a jump up. There's something, it's like that old one about playing tennis without a net. There's something about the presence of the net that inspires you to play your best game. So, as Sean mentioned, I have this piece up on the Harvard Review website. You can find it easily. It's the title is something a little clunky, like an author interviews his mom. And the clunkiness says something about the difficulty of the awkwardness of the situation, what we were trying to grasp at. I was just, after publishing, I was just so aware that that I had imposed a story on people who were otherwise silent, and I wondered about the right and wrong of that a bit. I mean, at the same time, I was very interested in that, in the context of the writer's search for honesty. I wrote this book never thinking that it was a memoir. I didn't know what I was doing exactly. It sort of took form piece by piece, and I didn't imagine it out in the world. I just imagined it as a very private enterprise, and the thought that anybody would ever see it was unthinkable to me. And so I didn't mention it to my mother, and my father passed away in 2002. I didn't mention it to anyone until I spent summers in New York at my mother's apartment, so the books from the publisher came there. And my brother sent me who's in New York, sent me a photo, texted me a photo saying, your book's arrived. And then the lid was open and there was just one book missing. And he's like, he was like, Mom took one, sorry. Then I was like, it suddenly dawned on me that this was happening in the real world, and that, and now what what was I going to do? I felt so duplicitous, and it all worked out. She was very generous, very generous. And I tell students that for the most part, if people feel like they're dealt with sensitivity, their response is generous, in my experience. I think people want to be seen in an open-hearted way. I think the memoir is an essentially compassionate medium, and that anger is the least interesting thing you can say about any experience you've ever had. It's not that you can avoid anger or suppress it or displace it. It's just that it's one among a series of feelings that you're having. And what I tell students is you need the full symphony of emotion on the page. Well, it's an endless subject, so let me return this.
That's a great quote, too. Jane, you mentioned something that resonates, and we had a panel yesterday about writing through trauma, and one of the panelists astutely mentioned her advice, which was, it's everyone's right, it's everyone's prerogative to write about whatever you want, anytime, about anything, but for it to be for an audience, it behooves the artist to let that settle. So in particular, writing through trauma, maybe that's fit for a journal to have that anger, that fresh wound, but some perspective accrues, someone's changed through trauma. What you're talking about as well, I think what you're both talking about is revisiting something that happened, with enough perspective to be able to approach it with generosity, with perspective, without scores to settle. And I think that could dovetail into a bunch of different discussions. I think everyone here would recognize works that aren't written with that spirit of generosity and the attempt to be not objective, but to be fair and have the kind of the implicit responsibility of being the writer. It's a tremendous responsibility to not take shortcuts and not be fair to the writer. So maybe talk about a little bit, how the distance helped you, maybe as you process certain things, or how different would the books have been if you'd written them sooner or attempted to?
I'd say, first of all, if you're still going through an experience, what you're going to write is not a fully realized memoir, because much the way a protagonist in a novel has to change over the arc of the story, you have to learn something. Same deal with a memoir. Otherwise, people aren't coming on the journey with you over the arc of your story. So in order to come out the other end and cast back, it takes a lot. In my case, the trauma of this took me a long time, because it took me a long time to realize, I kept saying, why didn't I have any agency? Why didn't I stand up to my mother? And I realized, because I didn't hear my own voice, I had no voice. Why was that? Well, I'm the adult child of an alcoholic. Let's start there, and let's look at the role that alcoholism played in my family dynamic. And I could not have gotten there for a number of years. I needed to sort of have the perspective that I got. Also, I think being a mother now helps, because I can let my mother off the hook a bit and understand she actually really was trying to not let my father once again screw up a big important family event. But at the time I just thought, oh my God, Cruella, what are we doing now? And I will add that if my mother had been alive when I wrote this, she would have been litigious. I'm sure that she basically told me to wait until she was gone.
That's so interesting, because it reminds me of a section, I think it's in my book. I'm now confused. I have also pieces that didn't appear in the book. My father, sort of when he began the last period of illness, he ended up in the emergency room, and through some strange, that sort of complex triangulation we all use towards tragedy, instead of going to get him, my mom called me and said, "Go get him." And what I heard was that I was to rescue him. You know, we all hate doctors, so I was going to go and steal him out of the emergency room before anything could happen to him. But on the way, there was this tremendous desire just to keep the world as I had always known it, where he was a strong, healthy, full presence in my life. I didn't want to face whatever that emergency was. So I decided to walk to the hospital. And it was a long walk. And then I passed a fruit stand, and I decided to get some fruit and have a snack. And ultimately, I just wanted the world to stay the same. And I'm wondering if perhaps that was a little bit how your mother may have felt. I don't know. What was the original? Oh, about distance, of course. Right. So I think one of the big helps is the act of writing itself. I got a little bit of a hand on my project just by thinking about genre. I could have told my family story as something of a tragedy, but what I realized is it came out so much better as a comedy. And none of the emotionality was lost through that decision. In fact, it was heightened. And the sorrow was all there. And the human culpability was, if anything, clearer. And yet, it was funny. And as any writer knows, to write funny requires a kind of sharpness that brings out your best stuff. And that was like really a central insight for me. Once I had it, stay funny, I knew how to go. And it really got me to the end.
And I think that reinforces what we were talking about. I mean, and I don't know if this is an actual quote, I've seen it in movies, but comedy is tragedy plus time. It requires the time. I think that's indisputable, and I think it speaks to your maturity as a writer, that you obviously have processed to the extent that you were able to see the humor. I think it's fair to suggest in 2002, I think the writing would have been excellent, but there probably would have been a lot funny in it. And Jane, in yours, definitely heavier in many ways, but you infuse, you find or recall and convey the humor. So on a narrative level, I thought it worked very effectively to lighten what at times was very heavy, very honest and profoundly deep stuff. But you were able to, I think for the reader's sake, but I wonder, in your own experience as you were writing it, how critical was humor and levity, even in terms of, because you jump around, which is compelling. Was that a conscious? I'm sure it was. But talk a little bit about how you lightened up what at times, could have been a pretty, not depressing, but tough read.
I do think humor is really important, and I 100% agree with you that it takes a long time to get there. First, you get angry, like anything, you pass through all these different stages. By the time you can see the ridiculousness in a situation like the fried chicken, in my case, and there are many, many more throughout the book, that's family dysfunction at its finest, has really funny moments in it, and sometimes that, thank God, when you see your siblings so many years later, is what you laugh about. Is, can you believe, do you remember that Ruth Ann Middleton? Oh my God, what a cow she was, the wedding planner. And this is the kind of thing you remember. It's not like the other stuff goes away. But it's so important, as it is in life, whether you're a writer or not, to be able to find the humor in situations. It's one of our coping mechanisms. But certainly if you're writing about it for an audience.
Yeah.
I was gonna tee up.
It's
Yeah,
hard to
no,
know
go
what
ahead.
to add to that. I think part of finding the humor is embracing the fragility and weakness of everybody in the story. I hear about the fried chicken. To me, it sounds like, well, he wasn't very eager to get to the hospital.
Right.
Who could blame him, really, right? Who wants to walk into a hospital? Who wants to see that kind of suffering? You don't want to see the suffering because you love the person who's suffering. You also fear for yourself, right? Everybody has a sense of their own fragility. When I got to the emergency room, I found my father there, and he was like, let's go. They had him in a bed, and there were no doctors around. I just walked in, nobody stopped me. I walked back into the rooms where they keep the patients, and I was like, hey. And he's like, let's get out of here. And I was like, you don't have any clothes on. And he's like, they put him in a cabinet, find the cabinet. So I found the clothes, and I was just about to hand him his pants, and a doctor comes in. And they give him one of those cognitive tests, and he fails it completely. He doesn't know what year it is, and the doctor says, "Who's president?" My father, who was always a charming conniver, I said, "They're all thieves. Doesn't matter." And the doctor said, "Well, who's the thief now?" And my father said, "Carter." So he flunked that. And then when the doctor left, my father took my hand and he said, "Are you frightened?" And I don't know, what did I say? But I was terrified. So, we're all so delicate. And I think comedy comes from that sense of everybody's vulnerability.
And I think what's really fascinating to me is even effective comedy pulled off, depending on the eye of the beholder, like there are elements that are funny there's so much pathos and sadness. Even with the comedy, it's infused with this heaviness that it's not masking so much as showing the shades of you find humor or you're able to see years later, that's actually pretty funny, where you weren't able to. I want to make sure we leave room for questions. I just, very quick, maybe in 10 words or less. I think I know the answer, and you already I cheated a little because you already addressed it a little bit, but I'm just curious, did you initially try to approach this as fiction and ultimately decide, or did you know, in terms of the story you wanted to tell, this has to be memoir? And maybe there's not an easy answer, I'm just curious if it was something you toyed with and eventually came to memoir, or knew all along, like, this is going to be a memoir at some point?
Yeah. Well, I had completely displaced the fact of what I was doing because the responsibilities entailed felt overwhelming. So I did not see myself as writing a memoir. I did see myself as writing nonfiction. And since I'd written 2 novels, there was this kind of refreshing, I don't know, I think I found something very stimulating in just exploring a new kind of writing and a new relationship to life. We could talk all day about the relationship of memoir and fiction. It's very revealing that we only have 2 genres, really, fiction and nonfiction. They're defined against each other. It's a very odd, we don't say, for example, faction. Why isn't it called faction? And you could just ponder that question all day.
Are you pondering? To confuse that matter, I will say that in French literature, there is much more of an overlap, a creative sort of pseudo-fiction, and I believe as time goes on, there will be more of a fusion between fact and fiction, because it's just a question of everybody giving themselves permission. It's really the booksellers and the editors who demand that it be one genre or the other, because they have to know how to sell it and how to market it and what shelves to put it on. There's always elements of fiction and fact and fiction. For me, I thought about it. I thought about doing this as fiction, but the reason I wrote it was because I'd written an essay for an anthology, and the editor who ended up publishing the book came to me with a contract and asked me to expand it, so it already sort of was put in the memoir category. But she also said, this really did happen. So write it that it happened, because anybody can make up that your father died the same weekend you got married, and that these two very different families came to stay at one house together while this was going on. And she said, but it's more interesting that it happened.
So, any questions? Sir?
You might recall, I think it was back in 1976, that term faction became popular when it was applied to Alzheimer's roots, but they couldn't figure out what type of words to give them. So you might want to go back and look at that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, no, I didn't know that. I do remember roots, though.
And it was especially when they were trying to give it an award, what category
Yeah.
it fit into.
That's right, I remember that.
After that came the plagiarism and all.
Can you repeat his question, please?
With the publication of Roots, that the term faction was popular for a while after Roots.
And then, of course, there was also In Cold Blood, and I mean, there were a few things like that as well that have sort of explored it more from taking a piece of history, nothing that happened to oneself. That's sort of taking either a piece of history or a piece of journalism and applying sort of a readability to it that started to take the form of fiction, but wasn't fiction, so it fell into this middle ground.
Sorry.
I would just, before we move on, I would just add, Alex Haley was really in the mix twice because of the autobiography of Malcolm X, an extraordinary book that clearly, it's not an autobiography. It exists in some space, in some collaborative space between the two men, so super interesting.
Yeah. Ma'am, you have your hand up.
So I'm interested in, Jeanne, that you were able to vet or let your siblings read your manuscript before it was published. In certain situations, that is not possible. For instance, 2 years ago, two of my sisters blindsided me and let me know that if you continue on to write this memoir about our mother, we will never talk to you again. And it's not that they're concerned for themselves, it's they're concerned about the reputation of our dead mother. And so they have made it very clear that they will not do that. And it's part of the dysfunction of my family that my mother wanted to always be seen as blameless, the martyr, and the saint. And that leaves me with being re-traumatized, because part of my trauma in my childhood was having my voice squelched. So it continues on, and how do you deal with that?
Well, I can empathize with that. And as I said, my mother would have been the same way. Bear in mind, every family is dysfunctional in its own way. Mary Carr, the memoirist, had a great quote, which is the definition of family dysfunction is any family with more than one person in it. If I were to advise you on this, and we could talk about it after if you want, but my sense would be you should write it anyway, and if you decide you want to publish it, if there are ways that you could fictionalize some parts of it such that it is a fictional character, but I understand the burden of what they've put on you. I do understand that. A lot of people would just say, fuck you, and move ahead and do it anyway. But people are different. Everybody's different. And what you have to do at the end of the day is judge what's important to you. And bear in mind, too, that any nonfiction that is published by a publishing house, a major publishing house, is vetted by the lawyers. They have to do that to cover their own asses so that there's not cases against them. And a lot of stuff gets reviewed through there, which is another level of safety. But in terms of the personal relation with your sisters, that's a different matter.
Well, I've already published 2 memoirs, and they didn't like how they were portrayed. But they never said, I'm never going to talk to you, until they found out that our mother was going to be written about.
I hate to say it, they sound like they're very good characters to write about.
Yeah.
So this is a serious question. It may not sound serious, but I'm dead serious. Do either of you think that there is a way to tell the true story of familial pedophilia with comedy? That's what I thought.
No, I mean, tackling that topic at all, talk about writing through trauma. Again, I think it's a personal thing. That's between you and the page. Or you and the page and your writing coach and possibly even your therapist. Therapists are very important. And if you look in the acknowledgments of any memoir, you often find deeply buried in there whether they're identified as such or not the therapist or the team of therapists. I would not feel comfortable making a blanket statement about that. It would have to be a specific conversation, which we can have if you want to have.
I would love to.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm here all weekend.
Good.
I sound like I'm playing a band somewhere. We're here all weekend.
Any other questions? Well, we're right at time. Any closing thoughts? Back to fiction, more memoir. What's next?
Well, I guess first I'd like to say just what a pleasure it's been and how much I've enjoyed being here with you and talking about this really unresolvable question. I think one of the interesting things about memoir and this question of fact and faction and fiction and nonfiction is that it ties to the deepest questions about how we know the world and how we move through it. So I'm always just enormously interested to hear what people have to say. What's next? I don't know. I'm actually working on a little more, sort of a couple of memoiristic pieces, but then I'm hoping to move back to fiction, or perhaps to find some space between the two. I'm very interested in writers like W.G. Sebald, who occupies some sort of zone between the two. I just think there are interesting possibilities out there.
I'll also add what a pleasure this has been. It's rare to get such a nice audience in the middle of a heat wave in the middle of the summer on the weekend. For me, what I want to write next, I'm going to start as a memoir because the scaffolding of fact feels like the right place for me to be. And then I might veer into fictionalizing it only because of levels of confidentiality for people that really shouldn't be outed in various ways. But it's another one of these situations where tragedy and humor are walking hand in hand.
So we'll leave it there. I want to thank both of you for reading your wonderful work, and for the third time, encourage everyone to pick up a copy and enjoy these really beautifully written books. Robert, Jeanne, thank you so much for being here.
There will be others.